Hello and welcome to this conversation on Dante's Inferno. My name is Matthew Lee Anderson, and I'm a professor here at Baylor University, and I'm also the project coordinator for 100 Days of Dante. I want to extend my gratitude to all of you who are watching this conversation. We have just been overwhelmed by your response to this project, by your engagement with our social media team, by the emails we've received. It's been enormously gratifying to us. We're very, very grateful for your enthusiasm, for your excitement about it. It's been one of the best things that we've done. It's also an entirely volunteer effort. We're very grateful to all of our contributors, and I'm especially grateful to today's participants who are donating their time and their expertise. It's an enormous effort that we've been through, and we're very grateful to all of the people who have made this happen. Especially grateful to the Honors College at Baylor University, who have been the lead partners, and to our other schools who have supported this project, and to the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust for some financial contributions to this. We're very excited about today's conversation. Dante's Inferno is, of course, an extraordinary text. We've been through it. There's been much that we've learned from the various videos, but we wanted to have a conversation where we explored some of the themes in a little bit more dialectical way, where we raised some questions. So we're very excited about today's conversation. Professor Jennifer Howell is going to be moderating it for us, and I will turn it over to her now.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you to all of you who are joining us today for this conversation. Really what we're doing is inviting all of you alongside us as we dig more deeply into the whole picture of the Inferno as a text. So to do that today, I'm joined by Dr. Anthony Nussmeier, who teaches at the University of Dallas. I'm joined by Dr. Leonard Oakland from Whitworth University in Washington, and finally by Dr. Janelle Eigen, who teaches at the Torrey Honors Institute at Biola University. So welcome, esteemed colleagues, to our conversation today. I think we can just dig in. And so to do that, I'm going to begin with a question. And Leonard, I'm going to call you out first and ask you to answer this question first. But of course, all of us are invited to share our thoughts on this. The question I want to start with is, tell us about the first time you read Dante's Inferno and the impact that it had on you personally.
The first time I read the Inferno was my first year of teaching at Whitworth College in those days. I was given a course that was world literature that included Homer, Virgil, and Dante, and I had never read the Inferno. I had never read any of the Divine Comedy, a snippet or two in a class. But I suddenly had to sit down in the fall of the term and read Dante. And from the first, I was fascinated, I was engaged, I was at times overwhelmed by some of the characters, yes, and I'm sure we'll talk more about those individuals, but it was the structure. It was the physical organization of the 9 circles of the Inferno that immediately fascinated me, and to watch how Dante built this physical world, if I can call it a world, of the Inferno. And so I have ever since I have loved teaching the Inferno and the Purgatorio. So that was my first experience.
Others, what are your thoughts?
I'll jump in and I'll reflect with a little bit of honesty. My first reading of Inferno and Dante in general was very desultory. It just was. I think I was probably a sophomore in high school, and as part of a sort of survey course on the humanities, we read your typical selections from, if I recall correctly, probably Inferno 5, I'm sure Inferno 32 and 33, Conte Ugolino, the sexiest, most titillating parts of Inferno. And my instructor, my teacher at the time, was wonderful, and he did everything he could to make it interesting. But again, it was unconnected. It was aimless. It was a bit incoherent. And so my true first reading wasn't until I was an undergraduate at the University of Bologna. And really, I would say for three reasons. One, because I was reading it in Italy, which makes everything better. Two, it wasn't this desultory, sort of aimless, incoherent experience. I was reading it straight through. And three, I was reading it for the first time in Italian. And I was studying at the University of Bologna. And it was there that the geographical sort of instantiation of the commedia became real for the first time. Like New York City, Bologna is famous for its two towers. In the very center of the city, we have Le Due Torri. One is Garisenda and the other is Asinelli. Asinelli is still very perpendicular to the ground. Garisenda is so off perpendicular that it makes the Leaning Tower of Pisa look like a piker.
It's very disconcerting.
Yeah, it is.
You stand under it and you're like, how is this not falling over right now?
And so I'm reading Dante really for the first time, reading it in Italian, reading it in a sort of coherent, sort of horizontal way, Inferno 1, 2, 3, and reading it all the way straight through. And I'm walking in the city center and I notice a plaque on the back side of the Garisenda Tower. And the Garisenda Tower actually has on that plaque 6 verses, 2 of the final tercets from Inferno 31. In which Dante says something like quale par riguardar la Garisenda sotto chinato quando nuvol vada sovressa sì cherella in contrapenda tal parve Anteo a me che stava bada di vederlo chinare e tal fu l'ora che io avrei voluto ir per altra strada. I'm quoting from memory, not reading this, so it might have been a bit imperfect, but essentially Dante makes a beautiful simile between the action of the giant Antius in Inferno 31 and the Garisenda Tower. If you remember in Inferno 31, between the 8th and 9th circles, the giants are sort of acting as a bridge. And in fact, we have the bridge builder in Inferno, Nimrod, who is responsible for the construction of the Tower of Babel. And then we have Antius, the one who is slayed by Hercules. And in Inferno 31, he bends over to get at the level of Virgil and Dante to speak to them because he's a speaking giant. And Dante makes recourse to this optical illusion that is created from being in the presence of the Garisenda Tower, because it's leaning over so much that if you stand below it and a cloud passes over, it's as if it's tipping over on the spectator below. And so it was in that moment, reading Dante coherently, in Italy, in Italian, and then being at the Garisenda Tower, that I understood how Dante was weaving together the scriptural, the mythological, the literary, and even the geographical, right? Because the Commedia, above all else, is this geographically inflected text, centered on Florence, yes, but almost all of the Italian peninsula, because Dante is going about the peninsula, as he says in the Convivio, just as a pilgrim would go, with that experiencing that language everywhere. And so it was really that experience in Bologna and reading about the giants of Inferno that had the great personal and profound effect on me for the first time.
That's amazing. That's so cool, Anthony. So my experience was a little bit like Anthony's in the sense that my first experience of the Inferno was a profoundly ungrateful one. That's one of the Dostoevsky in Notes from Underground, The Underground Man defines humanity as a biped ungrateful. I think that's probably a good description of me as an undergraduate. I encountered Inferno in its entirety, read the whole comedy as part of the honors program that I now teach in, that I was in as an undergraduate. And didn't get traction on it really at all in that first read. I don't have good memories of it. I have a couple of memories of Purgatorio, of getting really puzzled in Purgatorio by the whole question of what might be needed in terms of purgation after salvation. That was the moment where I started to sort of think through what was happening in Dante and really try to wrestle with it. And then I, as many first-time readers do, was really troubled by Beatrice and the role that Beatrice had in the comedy. And so those are my main impressions of my first time reading through the Inferno. And it was only later, as I started to teach it, that I started to realize the incredibly beautiful structure of it. I had become a student of the Seven Deadly Sins tradition at that point, and started to sort of see the way that that was being worked out in really interesting and incisive ways in the comedy. But I think my lesson is one for readers who are having a hard time getting traction in the first read, to say, don't give up. I guess with both Anthony and I, don't give up if your first experience of the comedy is one in which it's difficult to get to the good bits and really see what's worth reading in it. I think for me, it took a couple passes for it to start really making sense.
Yeah.
So what I hear you saying is that for all four of us, it was a bit of a slog the first time. I think I read it for the first time trying to stay awake on my dorm bed my freshman year of college, not really understanding why. And it was also part of an anthology, right? So it wasn't even the whole thing. It was just snippets, kind of like what Anthony, you mentioned. So when I think about the impact that Inferno has had on me, I do not think about my first reading. And I, again, want to echo Janelle and say to everyone, like, if it's hard the first time, I think that's probably normal. It's such a vast, sweeping journey we're on. It's hard to take in all at once, and certainly not as part of an anthology in an overpacked semester of Intro to English Lit, or Italian Lit, sorry, Anthony. Also, nice way to throw in that you studied at the University of Bologna, which is also where Dante studied. So nice little connection there.
Thank you. Yes, I mention all the time that when I introduce the University of Bologna, I tell them that lots of luminaries have studied there, like Copernicus, even Tesla, Dante, and then of course, Anthony Nussmeier.
Right, of course, right. So glad you could join us today. So I would say that for me, the big takeaway, that the thing that really grabbed my imagination when the first time I earnestly read the Divine Comedy was the logic of hell. So of course, the structure very much has something to do with that. And we should not gloss over the geography, right? The geography is so powerful. The forms of movement, we're ever going down and left. It's a spiral, right? Think of Augustine's account of evil as a turning away of the good, right? It's the twisting of the good. That's what we're doing in hell. We're twisting the good. And so I think that prior to really contemplating Inferno, my conceptions of hell come from childhood, where I imagined this like red glowing desert landscape with pitchforked devils. And that was it. And you just got stabbed by pitchforks. And suddenly reading the Inferno, like the reality and embodiedness of sin really started to come alive for me. It's like, oh, sin actually does things to you. Look at what it does. It's not this static, disembodied state. It literally impacts who you are.
And Jenny,
yeah.
Jenny, don't your students, aren't they surprised that you don't meet flames in hell till you get to circle 7?
Yeah, and it's not at the bottom, right?
It's not, yeah.
It's ice
at the bottom. It's ice instead of fire.
Yeah. My students usually are like, wait, it's not pitchfork devils. And then they're like trying to figure out the logic. So we'd like, okay, we're at this circle and here's the punishment. Why? Why is that the punishment? And they really start to get into trying to anticipate and think on their own terms. Why would this be the logic of this punishment?
And I think that's one of the most important experiences, at least for me and my students, in reading the Inferno, to figure out how is the punishment appropriate, or in any sense of the word, any logical, rational sense.
So do you guys think this is why the Inferno has stood the test of time?
I think that, yeah, the idea that sin isn't just wrong because someone arbitrarily said that it was, right? But that there's actually something that is going wrong inside of a human being, that sort of contrary to their own good and to the way that their own good fits into the good of everyone around them and their relationship with God. I think that, yeah, if there is one obviously there are lots of theological concepts that Dante is speaking to in a lot of depth and clarity, but I think probably number one on that list, at least in Inferno and Purgatorio, is the concept of sin. And it is that Augustinian concept of sin as a perversion of the good, right? Sin isn't a contrary force that's sort of pitting itself against good. Everything in the universe is good because everything in the universe was created by God, which means that even Satan at the center of hell is still surrounded by God. The furthest he can get away from God is to be in the center of God's universe. And the most he can do to get away from the love of God is to use his own motion, which is a parallel to God's motion, to try to freeze himself, right? And so the way that Dante has captured in his universe this Augustinian idea about what it would be like to live in a monotheistic system, as opposed to this kind of the dualistic system that is actually a lot more instinctive to human beings. But to think like, no, if God created everything, and that means God created everything. That means God created Satan. That means God created hell. So what do we do with that? How do we understand sin in that context? I think that's one of the really great markers of the comedy. One of the things that really makes it stand out and last. It's so coherent in its explanation of why that would make sense.
I'd like to ask, how do you teach the idea of the appropriateness of punishment? One way to look at it is that it is symbolic retribution, which I think of as, if you keep the car out too late at night, your dad says, no, you have to leave it in the garage. You can't drive my car anymore, quoting my dad. But actually, I teach it a little differently, but nothing works perfectly for me throughout all the 9 circles. I teach that it is an incarnational idea that God, in the punishments, allows the sinners to be what they already were in life, only now eternally and petrified. So it isn't payback so much, it's that they give. Francesca and Paolo in the circle of the lustful get to be blown around just as they were all their lives, blown by passion. What do you all do in your classrooms about the punishments?
Yeah, I'm reminded of what my theology professor in seminary taught me at Duke. He said he believed that there was no one in hell who didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
Right. There's a freedom here. And so this is people have given themselves over to their greatest passion or distorted love. And that's why they're there. There's no one in hell who doesn't want to be there. I think that it, resonates with how you're describing this.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
I agree with a lot of what's being said here. And speaking about the freedom, I would use a precise term, and that's free will, of course. I think it was Charles Singleton who first pointed out that if you go to the very center of the Divine Comedy in Purgatory 16, and you count back 75 verses and forward 75 verses or something like that, you have the only 2 instances of the expression libera voluntas, free will, in the entire Divine Comedy. And that's, of course, in the context of talking about the disordered sort of Augustinian loves, or the types of love as filtered through Augustine, and especially the disordered love that we encounter in the Inferno. And so I think free will has a lot to do with it, and not just simply, as Leonard, you pointed out, retribution. I mean, there's a sort of justice here, and you have free will, and these sinners have freely chosen to be here. getting back to the question, Jenny, that you asked about the durability of Inferno, that's something that was lost, especially in the 19th century. Part of the durability of the Inferno is due to those pesky English romantics who saw Inferno 5 not as a cautionary tale, but something to emulate. Right? So there's a reason we call the 19th century the century of the Inferno, because they looked at these things and they said, yes,
Lean into it.
That's what I want to do. And, you know, if you go back to in London and other European cities in the 19th century, there were these touring groups who would put on spectacles based on the comedy, and they always did Inferno 5 and Inferno 32, 33. They always did Francesca e Paolo, and then they always did Conte Ugolino, without exception. You go back and read the newspapers from the 19th century, that's what they were doing. And so they saw these things, and they said, that's where I want to be. And
Dante himself knew the attraction of that, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, this is why Virgil fusses at Dante at the end of Canto 5, because he is drawn in, he's seduced.
And Dante says, although only just almost, right? He says, fui quasi smarrito. I was almost lost, right? So he goes to the precipice, but he doesn't quite go over it, right? He goes to the line, but he doesn't cross it. And later on, of course, Dante, the character, revises that earlier reaction to the love, the profane love of Inferno 5 later, and in Paradise, different places of Paradise, where he said, instead of that one point being the sort of illicit love of Inferno 5, that one point around which I will rotate is God himself, right? So he kind of revises this as he goes along. And so, but yeah, I think it's wonderful, the idea that this is not just retribution, but you have freely chosen your sin, and as a result, you get what you get, and you don't throw a fit, as I say to my younger kids in many different contexts.
That's one way to sum up Inferno.
You get what you get. Yeah, I take Lewis to be, going back to Leonard's question, I take Lewis to be thinking a lot about Dante when he writes The Great Divorce, in trying to kind of get into the mindset of someone who would choose hell. There's a kind of an intuitive, like, well, of course, no one would actually choose hell. Like, why would anyone do that? And I think that I think Lewis, to me, has been the most helpful voice in trying to explain how this Dantean idea could be right, that there actually might be the choice or the unwillingness to sacrifice whatever it is that you're holding on to more closely than God. That would actually mean that you would be willing to choose to be blown around in a whirlwind, even though it's kind of terrible. And then, of course, that reflects back on what I choose every day of my life, right? It's like, oh, I actually do consistently choose to put my feet in hot fire, or to freeze myself in ice. Because I am unwilling to let go of these perversions within myself.
All right, so I want to extend this, because I think we're kind of hovering around a central question that our readers I've seen consistently bring up, which is the question of love. So we see at the beginning of Inferno a narration of hell as an expression of God's love. We've danced around this when we talk about free will, but let's draw these connections together more explicitly. Why would we conceive of a place as horrifying and terrifying as hell or Inferno as an expression of God's love? Why is that love?
Yes, you refer to the inscription over the gate of hell, where everybody remembers, abandon all hope ye who enter here. But the inscription also says that this was created from the foundation of all time, and it expresses the power of God, the justice of God, and the love of God. And certainly that's one of the most difficult things that my students deal with, that I face them with, and that I deal with. In what sense is hell an expression of God's love? And Anthony's already touched on that issue of free will, which is certainly one of the classic Christian answers. And I really like what how Janelle relates this again and again to Augustine, and Augustine's ideas of disordered love, as so that all of hell is really a series of different versions of disordering of love. So Janelle, what do you say to your students about it?
Yeah, I do think that this is one of the hardest things to process. And I think, honestly, the thing that is hardest for my students is the idea that there would be a cutoff point after which there's no opportunity to repent and come to salvation. So thinking back to the Great Divorce again, there's this idea that there's a kind of a twilight zone where there's still the opportunity to make a different choice, but eventually the sun will fully rise and fully set on heaven and hell respectively, and there will be an end to this choice. The suffering in purgatory, everybody can kind of get behind and say like, okay, I get that I would need to sort of be whipped into shape in order to even enjoy paradise. But the idea that at a certain point, God lets you choose something and not, and cuts off the opportunity to change what you have chosen, I think is the thing that is really difficult for us to get our heads around, because it's so unlike our experience here on earth, where there is this grace extended continually to us, and there's always the opportunity to repent and return to salvation. Yeah, it is counterintuitive to think that there will be an end to that there will be a point at which God takes my choice and decides to honor it eternally, for the sake of my eternal soul. And that the immovability of hell, I think that's the most difficult thing for us to deal with.
Yeah, when it comes to talking about the application of love and hell, I think about it in this way and talk to my students about it in this way, talking about the paradox of unity and the disunity of hell, right? Everything is unified in its fragmentary nature. Language is imperfect. Politics are imperfect. Music is cacophonous and imperfect and sort of strident. And so is love. And so misapplied love, misordered love, misaligned love it results in hell in a certain sense. And all of these things come together to form that unified logical, Jenny, that you were talking about, that logical construction of Inferno, which is really striking in its coherence, right? And so again, I think about the disunity, or the unity of the disunity of hell, even when thinking about love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's multiple layers going on here in our contemplation of love. So first of all, I think it requires us to think more carefully about how love actually works and the connection between love and free will, right? And this gets confusing for students sometimes too, because my students tend to have a pretty bankrupt account of freedom, right? They think of freedom as my rights, my right to protect myself, my right to do what I want to do. Whereas I think a more robust Christian understanding of love and freedom are closely intertwined, right? Freedom is the capacity to choose love or choose not love. Freedom is the freedom to be free for others or to be free from others, right? And so when we think about God's love for us in its abundance and how completely undeserving we are of it, and yet this gratuitous thing comes to us, it's the great mystery. Like, why does God love us this way? Well, there's freedom, right? We don't earn it. And so also us, we're invited into that love. We're invited to love others that way. We are invited to love God that way. And if love didn't have that kind of freedom to choose to not love, if we didn't have freedom to choose not God, then we wouldn't be able to fully love. And so hell is necessary because otherwise we can't freely choose God. If we want to freely choose God, we need to be able to also freely choose not God. And so you can see just the absurdity of hell, right? Like, why would anyone choose not God? And yet it gives us that agency. We have full agency over our life in some sense. And yet the grace also breaks in, right? We have the harrowing of hell, which we haven't talked about. But Dante has to go over the rubble, there's broken architecture, there's broken logic, because grace has descended into the depths of hell and taken people from hell up to heaven, right? And when we get to paradise, we're going to meet a pagan, and Dante's going to ask, why are you here? And he's going to be like, I have no idea, right? Like, so there's logic, but there's also grace. And we need to remember that as we try to unravel. Like, it is true that hell is logical. It is true that hell is grounded in love. And yet Dante doesn't let us completely solve it. We're still embedded in grace.
Yes, and Jenny, I teach in a Christian university. Most of you teach in a Christian context. But I think that I could teach and have wonderful discussions in a classroom that was filled with non-Christians who were hostile to a standard Christian interpretation. Going back to our topic of why does the Inferno stand up now in the 21st century, because I think that we could talk about exactly this idea of love. Okay, if you don't want me to talk about the love of God, I can still talk about love in your life, what you care about, your car, your significant other, your stuff, and how that distorts you. And that's what Dante's dealing with. It's richer in a Christian context because that's where Dante's writing from, but it is, but I think it works in a secular context as well.
Yeah, in fact, Leonard, I actually think that there's some of the cultural shifts that have happened in the last couple of years make for an easier reception of Dante than you might have had 10 years ago, where the prevailing cultural story had more to do with kind of you do you, to tolerance of anybody's different decision making. We've actually walked away from that culturally and come back to a standard where there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong, and those things that are wrong are destructive and you have to stop doing them now. And so I think there's actually the way that our culture has begun to recognize the destructiveness of sin again makes for a new kind of opening to understanding what it is that Dante is talking about here. There are sins that we culturally admit as being worthy of real punishment, and could imagine sort of the way that punishment might actually be as a result of love, not only for the person who's being punished, but also for the people who they've hurt. I think that's another element of this that we don't always think about, is the way that this justice has to do with God defending those who have been hurt by other people's sin on this earth.
All right, let's talk about Satan, or Dis. Did you find his Dante's depiction of Satan satisfactory? What's the theology there, or the political account there? What's he doing with Satan?
If I could jump in, I would preface this by saying I'm not a theologian, and so I would leave some of these weightier matters to the theologians among us, but I'm not sure there's anybody better placed to talk about the punishment meted out to the sinners of Inferno 34 than I, because I am in Minnesota right now, as I mentioned, but the pressing question of Inferno 34 and the depiction of
hey, I am from Minnesota. So
really?
if you're comparing Minnesota to hell.
Well, yeah, my question is, why is Dante's depiction of Lake Cocytus and the contrapasso of Inferno 34 so reminiscent of a Minnesota winter? That is the first question I would ask. But On a more serious note, there are a few things that strike me about both the depiction of Satan and how Dante portrays the sinners of, excuse me, that are present in the ninth circle and in Inferno 34. Above all, again, the asymmetry of the sinners in Inferno 34. So we have, very early on in the first few lines of Inferno 34, when he's viewing through the transparent ice, much as I might go ice fishing and look for a walleye on a frozen Minnesota lake, he's looking at these sinners, and he's wondering why they're arrayed in such an asymmetrical manner. You've got some that are face up, some that are erect, some that are soles of their feet are upwards towards the ice, some that are bent over. And so the overall impression that we have is kind of one of chaos, disorder. I mean, we talked about the order and the logic, and I myself mentioned it, but the asymmetrical and sort of chaotic nature of the way in which these sinners are punished is one thing that strikes me as we open Inferno 34, right? I'm talking about like verses 8, 9, 10, 11 right away. And then the other thing that strikes me is why ice and why are they frozen? And we've mentioned the static nature of hell and the idea that the movement of purgatory is really about movement, where stasis is omnipresent in hell. And so those are two things that strike me just upon reading the first few verses. And so I wanted to throw it out to everybody thinking about this idea of stasis, and especially about the choice to use sinners who are frozen underneath the ice, much as those targets of my ice fishing.
And if we could take it from the ice that Anthony has spoken about eloquently and talk about Satan down in the ice. I just finished teaching Milton's Paradise Lost, and Satan in Paradise Lost is a fascinating character with a great deal of movement. He goes from hell to earth and tempts and all of that. But Satan in Dante is this figure stuck in the ice, and he's boring compared to Milton's Satan. All he gets to do is chew 3 guys. So how do you teach Satan? I think he's rather boring.
I'll fight for Dante on this one. I actually, okay. I love Dante's depiction of Satan. Much more actually than Milton's. I think that Milton's depiction of Satan has a tendency to be potentially really misleading, because man, Milton Satan's just so sexy. He's got so much interest to him. The thing that Dante gets, so Satan is in some ways one of the most powerful characters in hell, right? He is one of the ones who is actively creating the environment of hell, but in the midst of actively creating the environment of hell, he is imprisoning himself, right? Like his very action is self-imprisonment, and it's imprisonment because to cease his motion would be to accept the melting of the ice and the sort of being brought into the love of God. I think it is brilliant. Like, I don't think there's any better description of the actual thing that Satan did in deciding to rebel against God than Dante's description. And the fact that he's sort of in the midst of his chomping is weeping, in sort of recognizing the frustration. I picture it as like my toddler's like frustrated tears. Like it's not pure sorrow. It's this like rage at the powerlessness that he has, right? He can't move, or rather he can't stop moving, which would free him. And that I just think it's brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a fascinating depiction of Satan, because I think we tend to think of Satan as cunning, like we're a victim of Satan, like that we're just, minding our own business, and Satan is a trickster that can bring us down. But this depiction of Satan, he's mute, he's dumb, he's slow, he's stuck, he's miserable. There's nothing, Janelle, there's nothing sexy about the Satan. Bat wings, And then we've talked about this before, the four of us, this act of chewing, right? He is chewing, but he's never swallowing. He's never being satiated. And I understand this as the anti-Eucharist, right? I mean, when you think of the Eucharist as Christ saying, here is my body, take this and eat, do this in remembrance of me. Here is Satan perpetually chewing and never being satisfied. It's the most despairing image. Can you think of anything worse than eating and not being satisfied, not being filled? And so he is the full embodiment of not God. There's nothing sexy about that.
Especially as you're crawling up his hindquarters. It's like hairy hindquarters.
Okay, let's talk about that. Can we just unpack how we get out of hell? Why do we get out of hell this way? What's going on there?
Well, in a physical sense, in Dante's fiction, Virgil leads the pilgrim Dante down the hairy belly and underside of the body of Satan. And then, as he explains to Dante in Inferno 34, he turns around and seems to crawl downward. But of course, he has passed the center of gravity of the universe, the center of the world. And so now he's climbing up into away from the body of Satan and into these rocks and streams. But how do you interpret that? I mean, that's just the story.
Okay, good. So Leonard, you have unpacked for us the actual process. Now, what does this, why this way?
Yeah, I'll answer. Oh, I'll talk about a slightly different thing because I don't know the answer to your question. So one of the things that I think is really interesting there is the way that it's Satan's fall that creates the geography of hell. Right, he falls into the center of the universe or of the earth, and that's what sort of creates that conical shape. And I think do I understand really? He's coming from the purgatory side, is that right? And then he kind of blasts out a circle on the other side. This is a real question that I don't know the answer to.
Well, it seemed to me that it was God rather than Satan who did it, who took this big cone that is now hell.
Yeah.
And made it a mountain on the other side of the universe, of the earth, which is all a water except for this island. So it was God's action that did that. Do others of you agree with me? Oh, and let me add that the last 20 lines or so of Canto 24, the last canto, they are really climbing into purgatory and seeing the sunlight, and especially that great word that ends every one of the three, the word stars. They look up and see the stars.
Stella.
Stella, yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an interesting choice though, right? To make this, and that Satan's casting down to the earth itself is what creates the infrastructure and geography of hell and purgatory, right? Like the land itself flees from Satan. And creates this mountain,
which does make perfect sense, right? The idea that it is Satan who creates the architecture of hell in being sort of the first sinner, right? He creates the necessity of hell, and also maybe sort of creates its structure. So I wonder, this is just shot in the dark. So we're climbing, when we begin climbing up the backside of Satan, that the whole process that has created hell is now being inverted, right? Yeah. The whole so
that's right.
Satan is literally being turned on his head in terms of the perspective of the story at this point. So he's been facing up until this moment, and now he's facing down. And the whole sort of sense of perspective, the whole up-down understanding that we have from now on in the rest of the comedy is with Satan inverted.
Exactly. And hell, Dante's constantly going down and left. Yeah. And in purgatory, now we're going up and right. So we're inverting and untwisting as we make our ascent up purgatory. It's brilliant.
Yes.
Good job,
It is
Dante the
brilliant.
Poet.
I still want to lay the claim that Satan didn't create hell. Satan is forced down into hell. The legend over the gate of hell says that God created hell.
Right. But it is Satan's impact that creates the geography, right? It's God's act via the agency of Satan.
Yeah, right. It's I imagine it as like kind of like a blast from dynamite, right? That sort of Satan hits the earth, and there's kind of like this throwing out of I guess Mount Purgatory, and the space that's left, which is, again, that's another Augustinian idea, right? That there's no substance to hell. Hell is an absence. Hell is a place where there used to be earth and now there isn't any. And it's in that cavity that hell exists.
Brilliant. That's brilliant.
And so purgatory is so earthy, right? It's so earthy. It's like magnified earthiness, where we're going. Okay, I want to be attentive to our time. We've only got about 10 more minutes. And so one question that I spend a good bit of time thinking through, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And I know we've had some readers ask this question as well, is what is the connection between Dante the poet and Dante the hero of this pilgrimage? Like, what do you think the connections are and what are the things that are different about the two? Or like, how do you think about this complexity?
I'll jump in just for a moment here. We've spoken about this in another context, but I would add another layer of complexity just to make things more difficult. We've talked about the bipartite nature, right? Dante Poeta personaggio, Dante character, and Dante the poet. But I actually think there are three Dantes operating here. Dante character, but also Dante the narrator, and then Dante the man or the poet, however you want to tease that out. And so that doesn't solve the question, but it certainly adds yet another layer of complexity, right? How are we to understand this man who has written a poem, this narrator who may be the man or may not be, who also begat the character, who may or may not be the same person as the narrator, who may or may not be the same person as the poet or the man himself.
I'm really glad you're bringing that up, because I feel like when Dante turns to us, it's a really important moment.
Yes.
Like, if Dante turns to you, you better pay attention.
Yeah. And so if we're thinking about the sort of trajectory of Dante character, Dante poet, Dante narrator, as we move throughout the Inferno, of course, we remember from Inferno 1 and 2 that Dante is fearful. He's hesitant. Virgil has to basically poke him with a stick and say, hey, come on, man, buck up. You can do this. And that doesn't necessarily change in my mind for Dante the character, because if you look at Inferno 34, he's still, in the Italian, it says retro al mio duco. He's behind his guide. He's still fearful. He's still hesitant. He's still willing to let Virgil lead him, at least as Dante character. But there, in thinking about these different Dantes, Dante the poet breaks through to readers not once but twice in Inferno 34 alone. And I think the final count of addresses to the reader in the whole comedy are 17 or something like that, where he says, caro lector, dear reader, etc., etc. In an Inferno 34, we have alone 2 addresses to the reader in one canto. And so I feel like Dante the narrator, or Dante the poet, becomes more emboldened as he goes along. And of course, he was always sort of emboldened, because in Inferno 5, he classes himself among the 6th in those 5, after those 5 great poets of antiquity. So he doesn't lack for sort of confidence, let's say. But I think in his addresses to the reader, that's one of these sort of extra literary elements that points to an emboldened narrator, at least, one that is more daring than Dante the character, if we compare the two, especially within Inferno 34. So again, how to exactly look at this is a difficult question, because I think it's not just a bipartite thing, but a tripartite between Dante the man, poet, the narrator, and Dante character. But I think I can say with some confidence that, at least in my reading, I see Dante the narrator or the poet becoming more confident than Dante the character, even as we progress along Inferno 34. Dante's still willing to be led by Beatrice, especially on up into Paradiso. He still can't get over himself and his infatuation for her. Of course, in Paradise 2, he's staring at her, and Beatrice has to say, no, eyes up here, Dante. You need to have your eyes on God. Stop looking at me. No matter how good his love may be and how chaste and Christian his love for Beatrice may be. So in any case, Dante the character has a lot more trouble than Dante the poet, in my mind.
So Anthony, just to follow up, do you see a progression in an evolution in the relationship between Dante the poet and Dante the character?
I do see some growth and evolution also in Dante the character, of course, because there are those sly asides where he basically says to Virgil, well, I'm sorry, you're just a pagan, even though you're virtuous and you can't know these things. And I do, by virtue of that I am Christian. And there is some greater confidence, but if you track Dante character's movements throughout the Inferno, think about Inferno 15 when he meets his great maestro Brunetto Latini, and there's that pathetic moment where he's so surprised to find him there. And then we see him walking alongside Brunetto Latini in a sign of deference and acquiescence to Brunetto's authority. And it's come uom riverente vada, as a reverent man goes with his master, so goes Dante the character. So he's still unwilling to call his PhD advisor by his first name. And for the rest of his life, he's going to call his PhD advisor Dr. whatever, at least as we were moving throughout the Inferno. So some progression, but I feel that Dante the character is not, doesn't grow as quickly and is not as emboldened as Dante the narrator or Dante the poet.
Sure.
I was just going to say, Anthony, I think it's also, I'm glad you brought up Virgil, right? Because in the context of Inferno and Purgatorio, Virgil's doing a number of different things, but one of the things he's doing is representing reason, which is there's a throwback there to Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and the idea here. So it's not at all unusual in medieval poetry for the action to actually be interior. Sort of all of the characters are actually different elements within an individual person's psychology. And I think there's a degree to which Dante is doing that here. So Dante the character is experiencing reason coming and teaching him things. But of course, reason is interior to Dante. That's not sort of an external person. And so the conversation that's happening between Virgil and Dante, I think probably is better interpreted as a conversation that's happening inside of an individual psyche rather than a conversation between two characters, sometimes on one level of what's going on in the comedy. So maybe that's a way to say, like, okay, you definitely do need to differentiate between Dante the character and Dante the author, at least enough to say there are other characters inside of the comedy that are also sort of that are symbolic of different parts of so reason, grace. There are lots of different things that would actually just all be at play inside an individual mind that are separated out into characters in the comedy.
I'm glad, Janelle, that you're reminding us that Virgil as kind of a part of Dante. Yeah. I certainly start teaching the Inferno by talking about the difference between Dante the writer and Dante, well, I call him the pilgrim. Anthony calls him the character. Because Dante the writer gets the whole of the commedia, the whole three parts, whereas Dante the pilgrim, Dante the character, doesn't get it. He faints at the end of Canto 2. He does inappropriate things. Virgil has to cover his eyes at about circle 6 because he's not adequate. He hasn't learned enough. And Jenny's question as to how much has the character learned by the end of Canto 34, I think that's a real question for me, whether he has really learned a whole lot. He has experienced a lot, but I think his real learning goes on in the Purgatorio.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I do think he gets into more the mindset that my students do as we read the Inferno, and that he is understanding there's a logic here, right? And so you do see him as he moves along becoming more sophisticated and thinking through why sin looks like it does and why the consequences of sin looks like it does. And that the fuller understanding of sin then prepares him for the fuller redemption that he's about to embark on as he.
Although it is an issue when he's down in Circle 9, he's kicking the head of Bocca degli Abati. And it's an interesting kind of learning that's represented by Dante now, kicking the head of a guy who's trapped in the ice.
Right. Yeah, that's an unsettling moment, right? Because there's a kind of righteousness to his kicking that we are uncomfortable with.
Yes.
And I think that's a good moment to show us the kind of sophistication that Dante is getting as he goes along, that we really are called to hate sin, right?
Yes, it's not a kumbaya kind of wisdom.
No, sin is deadly, sin is dangerous, and we are to hate it because it is that which is against God. So, well, I think we are wrapping up our time limit here. It was once again a real delight to unpack Dante with the three of you. And I want to extend gratitude to all of you who have joined in to this conversation. And we look forward to continuing our journey together onward.
Thank you, Jenny, and all.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks all. Great.
Thank you.